The Empress's Thread: How Asian Women Engineered the Silk World. Chapter 9: The Tomioka Girls and the Industrial Dawn. The geopolitical crucible of the 19th century. To understand the sheer magnitude of the burden placed upon the shoulders of Japanese women in the late 19th century, we must first understand the terrifying geopolitical reality of the world they inhabited. Imagine the global landscape of the 1850s and 1860s. The Earth was shrinking rapidly, bound together by the iron tracks of the locomotive and the copper wires of the telegraph, driven forward by the insatiable, roaring thermodynamic hunger of coal and steam. The Western powers, Great Britain, France, the United States, and Russia, were expanding their empires with ruthless, industrialized efficiency. Across the Asian continent, ancient dynasties were crumbling under the devastating weight of modern naval bombardment and unequal treaties. For over 2.5 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan had maintained a strict policy of national seclusion, effectively sealing the island archipelago off from this aggressive imperial expansion. But this illusion of perpetual, isolated peace was shattered irrevocably in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry's squadron of black-hulled steamships arrived in Edo Bay. The American warships belched thick, black smoke into the pristine Japanese sky, their decks bristling with advanced artillery that could effortlessly level the coastal defenses. Japan was suddenly staring down the barrel of Western imperialism, faced with a stark, horrifying ultimatum: open the ports to foreign trade on highly unfavorable terms, or be forced open by the devastating, world-ending power of modern naval guns. The subsequent imposition of unequal treaties stripped Japan of its tariff autonomy and laid bare the absolute vulnerability of its feudal order. The samurai elites who orchestrated the Meiji Restoration in 1868 recognized that survival required a total, uncompromising, and immediate transformation of the Japanese state. The old feudal domains were abolished, power was centralized under the Emperor Meiji, and a frantic race toward industrialization began. The national rallying cry became Fukoku Kyohei: enrich the state, strengthen the military. To avoid the fate of their colonized neighbors, Japan needed to build a modern conscript army equipped with breech-loading mini-rifles, construct an imperial navy boasting ironclad warships, and lay a sprawling network of railways and telegraph lines. And they needed to do it overnight. But ambition is entirely useless without capital, and the newly formed Meiji government was functionally bankrupt. Japan possessed virtually none of the natural resources, like vast deposits of easily accessible iron ore or gold, that the heavily industrialized Western powers desired. The national treasury was bare, and the prospect of borrowing heavily from foreign banks carried the fatal, unacceptable risk of economic subjugation and loss of sovereignty. The government attempted to launch its own modern industries, building state-owned shipyards, cement factories, and telegraph systems, but nearly all of these early, desperate ventures operated at massive financial losses. The capital required to pull a feudal society out of the past and into the industrial present had to be generated internally, and it had to be generated immediately. The salvation of the Japanese nation rested entirely upon a single, delicate, shimmering commodity: raw silk. At this precise historical juncture, an act of supreme serendipity presented Japan with a monumental economic opening. Across the globe, the French and Italian silk industries, which had long dominated the international luxury textile market, were facing catastrophic, total collapse. A devastating silkworm pandemic known as pebrine disease was sweeping through the nurseries of Europe, suffocating the continent's supply of raw silk. Simultaneously, the Taiping Rebellion was ravaging the sericulture heartlands of China, severely disrupting the flow of Chinese silk to the desperate markets of the West. The global market was suddenly, violently starved of its most lucrative textile. Western merchants turned their eager gaze toward the newly opened ports of Japan. The Meiji state immediately recognized that raw silk was their primary mechanism for survival. It was the indispensable currency that could underwrite the development of domestic industries, substitute for foreign production, and purchase the weapons necessary to secure their borders. Almost overnight, raw silk thread became Japan's leading export commodity, accounting at times for over 80% of the nation's total exports. When we talk about the miraculous modernization of Japan, the construction of the Yawata Steel Works, the purchase of the steamships, the outfitting of the military that would eventually defeat the Russian Empire, we are not talking about the abstract genius of male politicians in Tokyo. We are talking about the physical, agonizing labor of teenage girls. The entire architecture of the modern Japanese state was literally spun into existence by the calloused, blistered hands of the nation's daughters. They were the true, unacknowledged engine of the Meiji Restoration. The thermodynamic shift, from zaguri to steam. Despite the insatiable international demand for Japanese silk, the early years of this export boom were fraught with immense peril. For centuries, the production of raw silk in Japan had been an intimate, localized cottage industry. Women in rural farming households would process the silkworm cocoons using traditional, hand-cranked wooden reels known as zaguri. While this method was deeply ingrained in the agrarian rhythms of the countryside, the resulting silk thread was of highly irregular thickness, known as denier, and inconsistent quality. As the volume of exports surged in the 1860s, this hastily produced, uneven Japanese silk began to acquire a poor reputation in the highly discriminating markets of Europe and the United States. Foreign buyers complained that the thread was only suitable for the weft of a fabric, never the warp. The Meiji leaders realized that relying on scattered, unstandardized rural production was a critical, potentially fatal vulnerability. The global market demanded absolute uniformity, high tensile strength, and massive volume, qualities that could only be achieved through the brutal, precise application of modern industrial mechanics. To secure the nation's economic lifeline, the government intervened directly. They determined that Japan had to abandon the quiet, domestic zaguri handreel and embrace the roaring, thunderous power of the steam-driven filature. In 1870, the Meiji government hired Paul Brunet, a French silk inspector operating in the treaty port of Yokohama, to serve as the chief technical advisor and architect for a revolutionary national project. His mandate was clear: construct a massive, state-of-the-art, government-operated model factory that would import the finest mechanical reeling technology from France and introduce the uncompromising rigors of Western industrial discipline to the Japanese workforce. After surveying several locations, Brunet selected an expansive site in the town of Tomioka, nestled in the rich sericulture heartland of Gunma Prefecture, roughly 100 kilometers northwest of Tokyo. The location was chosen with strategic brilliance. It provided access to a massive supply of high-quality cocoons from local farmers, an abundance of fresh water from existing irrigation networks vital for the reeling process, and, crucially, nearby deposits of lignite coal necessary to feed the thermodynamic hunger of the steam boilers. Construction began in 1871, resulting in a colossal industrial complex that was entirely unprecedented in the Japanese landscape. The sensory reality of the Tomioka silk mill upon its completion in 1872 was nothing short of an industrial shockwave. The facility was an architectural marvel, a striking, beautiful synthesis of Western engineering and traditional Japanese craftsmanship. The massive reeling plants and cocoon warehouses were constructed using a revolutionary timber-framed brick masonry technique. Local Japanese artisans, guided by French technicians, baked thousands of red bricks, laying them carefully between heavy wooden pillars beneath soaring roofs of traditional Japanese tiles. The reeling floor itself was a true cathedral of industry, a cavernous, echoing space stretching out for over 140 meters. Its high ceilings were supported by complex triangular roof trusses, creating an open expanse capable of accommodating hundreds of mechanical reels without the obstruction of central pillars. The brick walls were punctuated by enormous, heavy iron-framed glass windows imported directly from France, designed to flood the floor with natural light and attempt to ventilate the suffocating atmosphere inside. But it was the mechanical heart of Tomioka that represented the true terror and awe of the industrial dawn. At the center of the complex sat the sprawling steam boiler plant. This brick structure housed massive iron boilers that devoured coal around the clock, generating the immense thermal energy required by the facility. This central boiler powered the colossal Brunet steam engine, a beast of iron and brass that drove an intricate, terrifying network of overhead belts, drive shafts, and gears spanning the entire length of the reeling floor. For the young women stepping onto this factory floor for the very first time, the experience was a profound, overwhelming sensory overload. The pastoral quiet of the rural village, punctuated only by the soft turning of the wooden zagury, was violently replaced by the deafening, unceasing roar of the steam engine. Hundreds of French-style metal reeling machines clattered, shrieked, and vibrated in unison, driven at a relentless, mechanized pace that cared nothing for human fatigue or human error. The thermodynamic engineering of the mill was designed for maximum extraction efficiency, turning the working environment into a physical crucible. To extract the microscopic, delicate silk filament from the cocoon, the sericin, the natural adhesive protein that binds the cocoon shell together, had to be perfectly softened. This required maintaining hundreds of individual reeling basins at a rolling, scalding boil. The steam piping channeled the brutal heat from the central boilers directly to the workstations, filling the cavernous brick building with a suffocating, blinding fog of humidity. The air was thick and heavy, with the distinct, sweet yet putrid odor of boiling pupae and the crushing pressure of industrial steam. It was within this roaring, humid, mechanized inferno that the young women of Japan were expected to forge the economic future of their empire. The daughters of the samurai and the blood drinkers. The workforce that powered this colossal machinery, known in Japanese as the joko, the female factory workers, represented a profound demographic and social shift in the nation's history. However, the initial recruitment of workers for the Tomioka silk mill in 1872 faced intense, terrified resistance. As the massive brick chimneys rose over the Gunma countryside and the strange iron machines were installed, wild, panicked rumors spread through the agrarian villages. Local populations, who had lived their entire lives under the isolated Tokugawa regime, whispered that the thick, black smoke vomiting from the coal boilers was a deadly poison. Even more horrifying were the rumors surrounding Paul Brunet and his French engineering team. The locals observed the foreigners drinking red wine with their meals, a beverage entirely unknown in rural Japan at the time. Terrified villagers became convinced that the Westerners were demonic vampires who extracted and drank the blood of the young Japanese girls they sought to hire. The fear was so profound that the Meiji government's official proclamations and distributed pamphlets utterly failed to attract a sufficient workforce. Desperate to staff the model factory and dispel the widespread panic, the Meiji government officials realized they had to lead by dramatic example. The first Japanese director of the mill, a man named Odaka Atsutada, famously forced his own teenage daughter to work on the factory floor to prove to the public that the facility was safe and that her blood would not be drained. Following this powerful demonstration, the initial wave of workers in the early 1870s was largely composed not of peasant farmers, but of the daughters of the displaced samurai class. These young women, stripped of their feudal status but retaining a fierce sense of honor, approached the steam-powered filatures with a disciplined pride. Among them was a young woman named Wada Ai, whose meticulous diaries and memoirs have survived to chronicle this extraordinary era. For Wada Ai and her peers, entering the roaring mills was viewed not as exploitation, but as a vital, patriotic service to a vulnerable nation. They were the elite vanguard, training under French instructors to master the complex machinery, with the intention of eventually returning to their home provinces to spread this vital technological knowledge. In these early years, under government control, the working conditions at Tomioka were surprisingly progressive. The women worked an 8-hour day, enjoyed Sunday holidays, received decent food, and were even provided access to an elementary school by the prefectural governor. The rural shift and the flesh of the joka. But this relatively enlightened era was agonizingly brief. Once the Tomioka mill had successfully proved the viability of French mechanical reeling, the technology spread rapidly across the country. As the silk industry exploded into a massive, highly competitive export market, the Meiji government began privatizing the mills in the 1880s and 1890s, selling them off to powerful corporate conglomerates. The daughters of the samurai, who had served their patriotic purpose, were rapidly replaced by a new, far more vulnerable demographic: the daughters of impoverished tenant farmers from remote, economically depressed rural villages. Industrial capitalists, driven by the ruthless dictates of the global market and desperate to maximize the profit margins of their raw silk exports, deployed aggressive labor brokers deep into the countryside. These brokers utilized a toxic combination of sweet talk, false promises of modern education in the city, and, most effectively, predatory advance loans to impoverished fathers to secure the labor of their teenage daughters. These advances effectively bound the young women in a state of inescapable indentured servitude. In regions where the competition for cheap labor was particularly fierce, the historical record indicates that instances of outright abduction were not uncommon. The physical reality that awaited these rural girls upon entering the newly privatized, profit-driven mechanized silk mills was a landscape of profound, inescapable physiological torment. Under private ownership, the progressive 8-hour days vanished. The shifts were mercilessly extended to 12, 14, and frequently 15 hours a day. Silk reeling is an agonizingly tactile, delicate process that cannot be entirely automated. To find the microscopic end of the silk filament on a cocoon, the joko had to plunge their bare hands repeatedly into the basins of boiling water to sweep the surface of the softening pupae. The scalding water, absolutely essential for dissolving the protective sericin of the cocoon, simultaneously and violently stripped the natural protective oils from the worker's skin. The physical toll on their bodies was gruesome and immediate. The hands of the joko were perpetually scalded, covered in agonizing blisters, and deeply cracked. The relentless, repetitive friction of feeding the microscopic threads into the whirling French machinery resulted in the characteristic, painful wearing away of the medial halves of the distal free edges of their fingernails. Their palms suffered severe maceration from constant submersion. Their forearms and wrists were frequently covered in painful, chronic erythema and small, weeping vesicles caused by continuous exposure to the boiling water and the chemical makeup of the dissolved silk proteins. If neglected in the rush to meet production quotas, these skin lesions resulted in severe secondary infections, leaving the workers in blinding pain as they struggled to maintain the relentless rhythm dictated by the steam engine. Beyond the destruction of their hands, the joko endured a systemic, terrifying assault on their respiratory and skeletal systems. The factory floor was a highly toxic microclimate. To prevent the delicate, wet silk threads from snapping under the high tension of the mechanical reels, the heavy glass windows were often kept tightly shut, trapping the immense heat and steam from the boiling vats inside the brick walls. The air was perpetually saturated with oppressive humidity and filled with microscopic, airborne silk allergens, cocoon dust, and the microscopic detritus of the boiled pupae. Subjected to this suffocating, poisoned atmosphere for shifts that regularly stretched from before dawn until long after dusk, the workers suffered catastrophic rates of respiratory illness. Chronic bronchitis, severe occupational asthma, and perpetual chest tightness became the standard, accepted condition of the workforce. The heat stress from the boilers routinely caused heat stroke, severe exhaustion, muscle cramps, and dangerous dehydration. The constant noise of the machinery caused widespread hearing loss, while the unnatural posture required to tend the basins resulted in chronic musculoskeletal damage to their backs, hips, and shoulders. Most devastatingly, the crowded, damp, and physically exhausted environment of the mills became a perfect, unhindered breeding ground for tuberculosis. Factory managers, driven purely by the metrics of export volume and daily production quotas, displayed a chilling, calculated disregard for the lives of their workforce. When a joko became too sick to stand at her reeling basin, she was almost never provided with adequate medical care. Instead, the capitalists routinely dismissed the critically ill girls, sending them back to their remote home villages to die. This deeply callous practice inadvertently transformed the economic engine of the silk industry into a deadly vector for disease, causing the rapid spread of tuberculosis throughout the pristine rural heartlands of the entire country. Yet, despite the agony of their blistered hands, the exhaustion in their bones, and the ever-present shadow of respiratory failure, the massive belts of the steam engines never stopped turning. The thread continued to flow, spinning the vast fortunes of capital that would build the railways, purchase the warships, and secure the nation's borders against the West. the architecture of confinement, and the walled garden of sisterhood. To extract this maximum efficiency and exert absolute control over their workforce, the operators of the privatized Meiji silk mills established a comprehensive, inescapable system of confinement. The Joko were strictly forbidden from integrating into the surrounding towns. Instead, they were housed in sprawling, high-density wooden dormitories built directly on the factory grounds. These dormitories were masterpieces of capitalist surveillance and control. Employers systematically crammed 10 or more young women into small, poorly ventilated rooms. The factory gates were heavily guarded around the clock, and the women were strictly banned from going outside the compound walls, rendering them virtual prisoners of the industrial complex. By housing the girls on site, the managers ensured that the workers could transition from their sleeping mats to the factory floor within minutes, maximizing every possible second of labor. The intent of the mill owners was brutally clear. By isolating the workers from the outside world, from the comfort of their families, and from any potential allies in the local communities, they could enforce total, unquestioning obedience. The managers employed a feudalistic system of labor control, enforcing relentless discipline through arbitrary financial fines, constant verbal abuse, and horrific corporal punishment. Workers who failed to meet their daily production quotas, who fell asleep at the roaring machines out of sheer exhaustion, or who dared to talk back to the overseers, were subjected to brutal retaliation. The historical record documents instances of sickening physical abuse, including managers torturing exhausted girls by pouring boiling water on them, exposing them barefoot to freezing snow, or subjecting them to the torment of mosquito swarms in the height of summer. However, the capitalists who designed this architecture of confinement made a fundamental, fatal miscalculation regarding the human spirit. In their attempt to isolate and subjugate the workforce, they inadvertently created the exact conditions necessary for profound, radical solidarity. Locked together within the wooden walls of the dormitories, sharing the same agonizing blisters, the same bone-deep exhaustion, and the same suffocating air, these young women from disparate, isolated rural villages forged an unbreakable sisterhood. They ceased to be isolated, vulnerable individuals and instead became a cohesive, highly self-aware collective. Within the darkened rooms of the dormitories, after the brutal 15-hour shifts had finally ended, a vibrant, resilient, and deeply compassionate subculture emerged. The older, more experienced reelers took the frightened, weeping new arrivals under their protection. They taught them the subtle, vital techniques required to survive the blistering water and keep pace with the rapid speed of the French machines. They shared their meager food rations, meticulously tended to each other's bleeding hands and skin lesions, and provided the critical emotional anchor necessary to withstand the psychological violence of the factory overseers. This intense communal bonding found its most powerful, enduring expression in the oral tradition of the Joko work songs. Throughout the long, grueling hours on the factory floor, to maintain their sanity and the relentless mechanical rhythm demanded by the steam engines, the women sang. These songs were not the polished, morally uplifting anthems desired and occasionally commissioned by the factory owners. They were raw, spontaneous, and deeply subversive expressions of their lived reality. Through thousands of verses, composed and constantly altered by illiterate and semi-literate girls alike, they chronicled the physical agony of the reeling basins, the cruelty and sexual harassment of the male supervisors, the profound, aching homesickness for their villages, and their shared, razor-sharp understanding of their own exploitation. The Joko work songs served as an invisible, unassailable network of communication that spanned the length of the roaring factory floors. The lyrics carried coded warnings about predatory managers, advice on how to pace the exhausting work, and powerful reaffirmations of their collective identity. The factory owners, standing above on their observation platforms, heard only the unified, rhythmic chanting that kept the production lines moving at maximum efficiency. They failed entirely to realize that the very songs that fueled their massive profits were simultaneously weaving an ironclad web of class consciousness and mutual reliance. The dormitories and the reeling floors, designed strictly as instruments of capitalist oppression, became the incubators of the first organized labor movement in the history of the Japanese Empire. The awakening, Agency and the First Strikes. History, when written solely from the perspective of state builders, politicians, and wealthy capitalists, often reduces the Joko to tragic, passive victims of an inevitable industrial machine. The historical narrative frequently centers entirely on their suffering, their scarred lungs, their blistered hands, and their abbreviated lives. But to view these women merely as the collateral damage of modernization is to strip them of their immense, ferocious, and historically vital agency. The young women of the Meiji silk mills possessed a clear, uncompromising understanding of their own economic indispensability. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the massive steam engines were useless without the delicate touch of their skilled hands. They understood that the national treasury, the warships, and the very survival of Japan relied entirely upon the thread they pulled from the boiling vats. When the exploitation of the mill owners pushed them beyond the limits of human endurance, they did not simply suffer in silence. They organized, they fought back, and they orchestrated the very first labor strikes in the history of Japan, acting entirely without the support of external labor unions or political agitators.